So I'm getting a little concerned for the people working in Meta's Quest kind of platform. I think that well, there have been two major moves this week that have gone on that I think signify not a lot of great news for them. Um, I don't want to be too doom and gloom about it. I'm reading into things a lot here, but the more I kind of look at different people's market positions and the way that they are developing these products in order to fit into certain price points, frankly, at this point, different places in the market, the more I think that Zuckerberg's and ultimately I think it's Boz who works there at the head of Meta's Reality Labs, seems like they're adjusting their focus away from kind of the VR space and more towards the AR space, which is interesting given that Tim Cook has been saying that AR is really the play for a long time, and the thing that they've built is effectively a VR headset. So it's a lot of preamble. Let me get to the news. So this week, there was a major kind of change in the way that, I wouldn't say major, there's a relatively small change actually in the way that Meta structures its Reality Labs, which is the part of the company that works on their kind of metaverse stuff on Horizon, on Quest, and now on the Meta Ray-Bans, right? And what they've done is they basically separated out into two different groups. Number one is the group that was always working on the Quest and Horizon and Metaverse and AR/VR, mostly VR type stuff. And another one that's working on literally just the Ray-Bans and has a little bit of an AI flavor to it.
Meta obviously was first to this, bought Oculus a long time ago. They restructured Reality Labs, the division that does all of their hardware, and Horizon, that cursed platform. This week, I had the scoop in Command Line. They are forming two new groups. So Reality Labs is now Metaverse and Wearables. So you will notice there is no VR in those two phrases, right? The Rift, I'm sorry, God, look how the Rift, wow. The Quest is now under Metaverse, reporting to Vishal Shah, who used to run ads at Instagram and is a software guy. So you basically have the thing that created this whole org that the company really bet its future on is a subdivision of a software org. Meanwhile, Wearables, I'm told, is leaning heavily into the Ray-Bans.
It's not that much of a change. It seems like those products were mostly working in separate spaces anyways. But I think this formal change is reflective of what kind of appetite the market currently has for face-worn wearables, and potentially what they might have for what is effectively an AR device versus a VR device. We're going to look at this through the lens of Ben Thompson's what he calls his mobile hierarchy of needs. And we've discussed this in the past in the context of why Zuckerberg opened up Quest's operating system, Horizon OS. It looks something like this. It's based off of the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That you have a set of needs at the base layer of this pyramid that are your primary needs, and then you meet those to a certain extent and you can move to the next rung, and then you move all the way up until you've met the needs at the top, right? He thought that when it came to mobile, that at the base layer, you have what we would probably expect, which is called hardware, right? Every computer needs hardware, makes sense. Not too much there to like read into, but hardware is an important piece of this puzzle. Above that, you've got your operating system, which again, is not necessarily mind-shattering, right? You need these two things in order to have a functioning computer. So sort of the bare minimum that you need for a product in order to be successful when it comes to hardware is a piece of hardware and then an operating system to run on top of it. Where it gets interesting is when you get to the layer of software, right? Software can be written by first party, can be written by a third party, but for our purposes, we're going to say that this is effectively like a third party ecosystem of software, or yeah, that's what we're going to call it for now. And at the very top, you've got this thing called services. And services usually pair with some app or some piece of software on a piece of hardware, right? And services allow you to use that piece of software to connect to someone else's computer out in the cloud. It's basically a cloud-first app. A great example of this is Google Search, which we'll come back to in a moment. I'm going to adjust this slightly. If this is Thompson's mobile hierarchy of needs, I'm just going to call this computing's hierarchy of needs, because I like there's a sequencing of these words that make it easier for me to remember, and so I'm going to go ahead and do it here. At the base level, it's still hardware, right? Of course, everybody needs hardware in order to run anything, right? The only thing I'm going to change in this is this next rung, which I'm going to call firmware, a term that I haven't used in a long time, but I really like in this context because firmware often refers to like the operating system, basically. But it's kind of blurry where we draw that line of what the operating system versus what the application is. And so when I talk about firmware, it's kind of like what the thing ships with in the box most of the time. If it was going to come as a product, what it ships within a box. So like, for example, the phone is on your iPhone, the phone app is a piece of software, very clearly, but I'm calling it part of the firmware, part of the operating system, because it's kind of baked in from the beginning. Of course, next is software. And you're starting to get at why I like this kind of continuum here, is at the bottom you got hardware, then you got firmware, then you got software. I'm sure that's why it was called that all along, but it fits this pyramid nicely. It helps us discuss it. And then of course you've got services, which is the most widely of the categories, I'll say, but is still very important for our discussion. And so there are two general ways to make things cheaper and to make these products less expensive, which I think is sort of the theme of what has gone on today. Number one, you had this meta reorganization within the Reality Labs thing, right? Which we'll see why that has to do with making the devices less expensive. And then the other piece of news was that Apple has kind of foregone making the next generation of the Vision Pro, instead opting to put those resources right now towards making what I'm going to go ahead and call is the cheaper version, the Vision Air, right? And so they're sort of marching down market from their upmarket position.
The Information had a good story out confirming and putting more details on what Gurman and others have reported, that Apple is indeed working on a cheaper Vision Pro. They hope to release it by the end of next year, and they have shelved a future iteration, a V2 of the Vision Pro as it is today, so another high-end, very expensive one. They're trying to get this cheaper one more into the ballpark of a premium, top-of-the-line iPhone price. So we're talking $1,200 to $1,500. I had heard even before the Vision Pro came out that Apple was already working on this cheaper version. Apparently, when Mark Zuckerberg was talking to me and others and basically saying, I'm going to scorch the earth with cheap headsets forever and not really care about making a business, which we will get to in the next story, Apple was like, oh, okay, we need to really work on a cheap one and get it out. So they've been working on it for already a couple of years. I do expect we'll see it next year.
The theme there is that things are getting less expensive overall. Just trust me with this, right? And there's sort of two ways to do that. One way is to commodify the hardware, or to commodify another piece of the kind of mobile hierarchy of needs, or in this case, computing hierarchy of needs. And the other way is to simplify, which is kind of what Apple's doing, right? In a lot of ways, they talk about, a lot of the reporting talks about Apple stripping things away from the Apple Vision Pro in order to get to this Apple Vision Air kind of product. And so simplifying that product is allowing them to potentially make it less expensive, if that makes sense.
Let's be real. They did the eyes because they wanted to be able to not call it a VR headset, right?
Well, so this is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
This next version, this cheaper version, they have to decide if this is a VR headset or an AR headset. And playing the eyes for laughs was the thing that signaled to me, okay, this is going to be a VR headset.
Bet strongly that there will not be the eyes in any future Vision Pro product. And I'll tell you why.
Yeah, it's just a bunch of cost for no reason, right?
No one's taking you on that bet. We like our money.
I'll take the bet. The eyes stay.
Well, it was a Johnny Ive thing. I know this from talking to people who worked on the Vision Pro. It was Johnny Ive who insisted that the eyes ship. I don't know the exact dollar amount, but it added an absurd amount of cost and manufacturing complexity to the Vision Pro.
Because they had to do that curved glass.
Well, the curved glass
or
was...
that curved glass in the display.
It was
on
having
the
the
inside,
front-facing OLED. I think it's an OLED, right, anyway? With the eyes.
Yeah, it's a very low eyes.
It added an absurd amount of cost. No one wanted to ship it except Johnny and his people, and they've all left. And so, and they're making a joke about it in keynote videos. So, I don't think the eyes are long for this world.
But so if you get rid of that and you're like, you cannot be perceived by other people in the world. The thing is a VR headset.
Yep.
Right. And that to me is concession in one way, right? They talked about this thing as AR, AR. But if you can't wear it with other people, like it's a VR headset, and then everything they've announced since is immersive, right? New immersive videos, new experiences, new immersive games. And it's like, oh, this is becoming a VR headset. And a $1,500 VR headset right now, the state of the art there is a pretty good product, right? Like, you can make something great for $1,500 VR.
So what I want to do today is go through the different paradigms in computing history of the ways that we interact with our computers and how those paradigms created opportunities or lanes, or in other circumstances did not create opportunities or lanes for different people to take the lead when it came to being the dominant tech platform that was out there. Starting with the personal computer. So the personal computer, the PC, right, was a result of a technological development, which was the microprocessor, right? This microprocessor made it so that you did not have to have this giant mainframe, a big room that was like a shared piece of equipment. It made it small enough and inexpensive enough, right? Remember, the theme is getting cheaper, that an individual might be able to own one of these devices, right? Of course, Apple seized onto this, and early on they created what they called the Apple I. Woz created a design for it and kind of threw together pieces of this. They had these components that they ended up selling, making a decent a bit of money, and kind of impressing their friends along the way. But where things got really interesting was when they created the Apple II, right? So the Apple II was really the first piece of PC hardware that we could call like inching its way towards the mainstream, at least in my opinion. Now, that was the hardware. Of course, it also needed a piece of software, and there are a couple of things, a piece of firmware, and there are a couple things that worked in that regard, but for our purposes here, we're gonna go ahead and call this Apple DOS, which is their operating system that ran on the Apple II. It was a command line, kind of like you go up to your terminal, you type away a command, it spits out a response, you can program it in that way, and that's what you mostly get out of this device. Now, it was good. It was a great piece of hardware, but what happened was that some developers got their hands on it because it was interesting, and they built this incredible piece of software that ended up selling the Apple II more than anyone possibly could have imagined, right? And so a couple pieces of software get built, and then in comes along VisiCalc, the first like modern spreadsheet. VisiCalc is known as like the very first killer app, because a killer app is something that people are interested in and that they want to buy, but in order to use, they have to buy the hardware along the way, right? So small businesses started to use this new spreadsheet software, which was kind of mind-blowing and game-changing for them. And along the way, of course, because VisiCalc was made for an Apple II, they had to buy an Apple II, which was good for Apple because that's how they made their money. Of course, they had to have a DOS on top of it. They had to have a piece of firmware on top of it that would allow people to make applications on top of that. But what people were really buying in this case, remember, was VisiCalc. People buy apps, not necessarily computers. The only reason that they ended up with an Apple II is because they wanted VisiCalc originally. And so this was great for Apple. They were making tons of money. It's what made Apple Apple. It's what made them one of the fastest growing businesses in the history of American business. But it also made it so that they were encroaching on IBM, kind of the incumbent computing behemoth. And IBM thought, oh, well, maybe we should actually pay attention to this thing because small businesses are buying these small little personal machines, even though they had originally ignored it. And so in comes along IBM, and on the base layer, they end up deciding that they're going to create the IBM PC. That's great. It was mostly a set of assembled parts, but it was, IBM's design the same way that Apple II was to some degree an assemblage of different components, right? But with Woz's design. And interestingly, though, the IBM PC did not make their own firmware. Now, remember, these two things in this part of the stack were made by Apple, right? They were they were of a piece. They were together. They were on their own. And so anything that VisiCalc might have made for this platform couldn't be put on anything else, because guess what? It was meant to be made for the Apple II, and in turn for Apple DOS as well. And that was great for Apple because it sold their devices. The IBM PC, on the other hand, had a couple of different options for firmware. It treated firmware kind of like it treated the components that they had. It gave customers an option. The most popular option was a piece of licensed firmware on top of this called MS-DOS. That's right, that's Microsoft there. It was great for IBM because what that meant is that they didn't have to create their own operating system. They could jump right into it. They created a computer very quickly and came to market, and developers realized that business customers were gonna really like this IBM PC because it was a brand they recognized, it was a brand they trusted, and it was one that they were already familiar with working with. And developers were right. A bunch of businesses started to buy these IBM PCs, and in turn, developers started to think more and more and more that this was going to be a successful platform and started developing for it. And so, whereas the Apple II had a lot of software and it had the original killer app, well, very quickly, first of all, spreadsheets came to the IBM PC, and then all of a sudden, all these other apps started getting developed for that platform because it was a flywheel. Suddenly developers wanted to build more software for it because there were more customers. Customers wanted to buy more of it because there was more software for it. And it was this virtuous cycle for IBM. That is, until the day that the first person decided that they also wanted to license MS-DOS from Microsoft. Remember, IBM made their money selling the hardware in this case, and that's why they cared about the design. The problem was, by licensing the firmware from Microsoft, they ended up opening themselves up to heavy competition. Here's what happened. This software that ran on top of MS-DOS was really writing software to the operating system, to the firmware, not to the hardware. MS-DOS, on the other hand, could be put on top of any number of pieces of hardware. And so what happened over time is you got these new manufacturers that would make compatible personal computers for MS-DOS, IBM compatibles or clones is what they were called, which made the MS-DOS platform that much more valuable and made the IBM PC much less valuable. Because what happened here is that you created competition at this very bottom layer. Customers didn't care what the hardware was like as long as it ran the software that they wanted. And so the more competition you had at that bottom layer, the cheaper and cheaper and cheaper those became. It was a race to the bottom. And so what that meant is that I, as a customer, could go and buy any old IBM compatible PC as long as it ran MS-DOS and had the specs to run the software that I wanted. And voila, I had a range of options in front of me that I could choose from. Compaq, HP, Dell, those are all of the names that we associate with this kind of like PC clone phenomenon. And what that meant was that PCs were relatively cheap. They were at the bottom of the market, but they were also dominant because this is what led to Microsoft taking control of power away from IBM. It was kind of an accident in a lot of ways, right? They positioned themselves well. They did what they needed to do for their business. Microsoft made money selling MS-DOS, but IBM kind of slowly faded away in terms of the relevance of having that premier position because guess what? Microsoft now was the important one in town because everything beneath them was commodified and there was too much competition. Pretty good for consumers, pretty bad for IBM. And so what happens? There was one other group of people that this was bad for, not just IBM. It was Apple, of course, right? Because people were still buying IBM compatible PCs and not Apple IIs. And so the only way to compete with that, because Apple wouldn't license their software or would not license MS-DOS from Microsoft, is to innovate. And so they decided that they wanted to innovate, and they created the next paradigm of computing, which was the graphical user interface. Now, it's worth pausing here to see why this is a paradigm shift. It's easy to see how going from nothing to the PC was a paradigm shift because you're going from nothing. But in this case, the graphical user interface was a profound paradigm shift because it made the computer more accessible to more people, right? Anytime you make something more accessible, it increases the scale and, of what that product can reach. And in turn, especially for a platform, should, in theory, make it more interesting and more palatable for a developer because now reaching more people. Apple's idea with this was to create the graphical user interface in its modern form, and they did it by making the Mac, which was hardware. And on top of that, they made Mac OS. Now remember, These two were bundled together. Apple kept them together. They made money using the Mac hardware, and they catered to a few of the developers out there who were interested in this new paradigm. But ultimately, this was still the era where people were being introduced to the PC for the first time. And so what that meant is that the familiar brand, the one that was less expensive, was much more likely to be purchased, especially as a first-time purchase, than the expensive Mac, which was really high up market, relatively speaking. And so Microsoft, who was kind of the behemoth now, becoming the behemoth now that we remember it as, realized that they could seize on this opportunity and sort of squash Apple as competition when it came to the Mac. And so what did they do? Microsoft comes out, and because they're making money primarily on this firmware licensing deal, they end up releasing Windows. And Windows was great for them, right? Because what that meant is they could build something backwards compatible with MS-DOS applications, still be IBM PC compatible, and have a great software library that still existed for the MS-DOS platform as it was. But it also let developers leverage and migrate to this graphical user interface, which also still made it more accessible to the average person, even if the graphical user interface that Microsoft created was not as good as the Macs. And so, importantly in this case, Microsoft made all of their money here by selling and licensing the ability to use Windows. They, of course, made a little bit of money as well, selling applications on top of that. Think Office, right? But especially importantly, those computers, those PCs that were now Windows PCs stayed inexpensive because everyone underneath the Windows had to compete for this little bit of space that was left. And that competition drove down prices even more. Apple, of course, didn't love this. It didn't do them very well. They found their niche. They sort of stumbled along after firing Steve Jobs and did their best to kind of stay alive until they neared their death in kind of the mid to late 90s. During that time, Jobs comes back. He's been plugging away at his own computer company for many years, and they do what he, I think, called a brain transplant, which was basically changing out the firmware of the Mac to make it a modern operating system, kind of setting the technological foundation for Apple throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, and now 2020s, frankly. And what that led to was the next paradigm shift of computing, which was mobile. Now, in mobile, let's think about why this was another paradigm shift. This was sort of the logical conclusion of the initial introduction of the personal computer to the average person, right? By this point, most people probably knew what a PC was. They probably used a computer at one point in their life, if not almost every day. And they had some familiarity with the conventions of using a computer as it may have been either with a Mac or a PC. What was profound about the phone, though, was that it was an application in itself, right? A phone itself is an application. You use it to call somebody, right? The iPhone in particular was also an iPod, which many people had at the time. And then even more so than that was this other kind of middle thing, which I'm skipping over, which is the internet, of course, very important during this time period. But the iPhone was the ultimate expression of human connection to other people as mediated through computers, right? Phone was the start of that. The internet was the next phase of that and has continued to be ever since then, right? But for Apple, importantly, the picture looked pretty much the same. When it came to the hardware here, at the very bottom, of course, it was the iPhone. And the firmware on top of that was what they called iPhone OS at the time, but we know as iOS on top of that. And remember, these two things were bundled together, and actually, in fact, it was capped for the very first year, where those were the only things that you could do. There was no application model, there was no software, there was really effectively no services either to sit on top of that, unless you call the web service, which is a whole discussion that we will not get into at this point in time. The point is that the iPhone was sold as a package on its own. And if you look back, you should start to notice a pattern in Apple's approach to this. They make the hardware, they make the firmware, and then they sell that. If there are people who come in with the right software, well, guess what? You've won the computing battle, and you now have a viable computing platform that people use for a long time. Of course, we know the rest of the story, which is that the iPhone opened up the App Store and there was an immediate flood of people who were developing for this hungry consumer market who wanted these apps on their phone. It was a sudden gold rush effectively. And very quickly, striking just at the right time, while the iron was hot and while the perfect set of technological threads were able to be woven together, we all know the story. Steve Jobs releases the iPhone to the world, and it's not an immediate hit, but it's all but an immediate hit for Apple. This cemented the iPhone as the winner of that era of computing. It was the same approach Apple has always taken with their computers, and it treated them very well at this point because they struck while the iron was hot, and they sold a personal computer, the thing that they were good at doing, in the most personal ways to just about every person on Earth. Of course, wasn't every person on Earth, because it was also an expensive device. They were still upmarket because integration is always kind of expensive, and you can charge a premium for differentiating your integrated product. And so Google sees this and they realize, oh, this actually might be a threat, because this paradigm shift from the PC to mobile is also a platform shift from the Windows kind of open licensed ecosystem of the world to this closed ecosystem where Apple has a lot of control over what happens on their platform. And if they're the only ones standing, that's not necessarily good news for Google, because now they're at the mercy of whatever Apple wants to do with the entire ecosystem, right? Including things like potentially blocking Google if they really wanted to. Not that they would have at the time, but that is the type of power that Apple has over that platform. And so what do? Well, they come along and they say, what we're going to do is we're going to release an operating system. We're going to release a piece of firmware that's going to kind of match what Microsoft did with both MS-DOS and with Windows, right? The idea was that if you create this operating system called Android, and on top of that, you build a small little app that we'll call Google, which is really a gateway to Google Search, which finally makes its way up to the services category, then what will happen is that the more people that are on an Android device, the more control you have over protecting where you're making money, which is up here at Google Search and selling ads. Notice where these dollar signs are in this diagram, by the way. It's very important, right? Apple makes it at the bottom of the stack. Google makes it at the top. And so what they did is they said, guess what? Because we don't have to worry about making money on Android, we want to protect the money that we're making on Google Search, which is increasing in value over time. We're not only going to license Android the way that Microsoft did with MS-DOS and Windows, we're actually going to open source it, pretty much give it away to the world for free. And in doing that, it increased the competition at this bottom level, right? And created a lot of really weird, creative sort of devices that people could create, allowed people to not only take Android and put it on stock, but also make it so that way that you could kind of build on top of it and create your own little micro platform that lives on top of Android. And that's not to mention the fact that this is also the most successful product category probably in human history, I guess, in terms of the technological side of things, right? And so there's lots of competition already. Android just was the nuclear option effectively. Carriers wanted it, customers wanted it, they wanted a cheaper option, and it worked effectively. Android, I think, still has the majority market share in the world. They did a very good job kind of getting as many places as they want. And you know what? Because of that, even though Apple had a running start, Google got a lot of these developers to care about it too. And so it's a pretty even balance as far as things go between Android and iOS. Before we go into the modern era and unpack the news using the same framework, it's again worth pausing and just looking back throughout history. Again, Apple always makes these bottom two rungs. It's every single time. And they always make money selling the hardware. The way people have made money throughout the years has actually leveled up in terms of this hierarchy of needs over time. IBM started at the base rung. Then Windows and MS-DOS effectively did it at the firmware rung. Finally, Google did it at the application and especially services rung. And so every time you elevate a level up, it allows you to make it so that there is a possibility of commoditizing and making cheaper the lower levels, because you now have increased the competition at that level. And so by maintaining that control at a crucial pinch point inside of the value chain, each of these companies has had to only focus really at 1 or 2 or maybe 3-ish, like 2.5 layers of the stack, and maintain control to protect their core business. And so that brings us to the next phase, which I'm going to go ahead and call VR, AR, spatial, right? Really, spatial is probably the best way to think about it. And this, for the first time in our entire recounting of history, is the first time that Apple was not first, right? So initially, you had this guy named Palmer Luckey who made the hardware for what he, called the Oculus Quest. So at the very bottom level, you have this thing called the Quest. And on top of that, of course, you need an operating system because that's the base layer of what you need. So this was Quest OS. Great. You can make some money doing that. Developers, it's ultimately a gaming device at this point for the most part. And so developers will make little game applications on top of that if you want to, and you can make some money in doing that. Another great way to make money is to sell your entire company to Mark Zuckerberg, who realizes now that the iPhone is a threat to his business because he neither owns Android nor the iPhone platform, and that he wants to own the next era of computing. So he decides to get his running a start before Apple can. So he buys up Quest and Quest OS and eventually renames the company to Meta, and then renames kind of the org that was Oculus before to Reality Labs, and renames Quest OS to Horizon OS. The reason I have this focus on the name is because it's representative of what Zuckerberg had to do in order to protect his core business. Remember, Facebook does not make money necessarily selling hardware. That's not their bread and butter necessarily. They, like Google, make money selling ads on a service that they provide, which is Facebook. You see, Zuckerberg sees computers as his way of connecting people. That would be what he would say, right? And in order to do that, well, that often requires a level of service, at least in the kind of modern era. And so what he wanted to do is to build a service all the way up at the top that we're going to call Horizon Worlds, or Horizon if you want to. I'm not 100% certain about the terminology here about what they use. I've always been confused with their branding. But Horizon Worlds Horizon is the Facebook of VR in a lot of ways. It's like a spatial version of what he thinks that we might do in the future, right? It's a kind of half game, half social network. It's like Roblox or like Fortnite, the way that some kids use that as a way to hang out. That's kind of Zuckerberg's vision for the future. But notice, if he's making money up here, you need to have something below that to support it, which of course is the application, which is Horizon, which itself is a heavy lift because that is an application, that is a new paradigm. It is a VR or AR experience. It is a spatial computing experience. It is something that is not fleshed out already, right? So by starting up at the service level, you have to invent everything underneath it. That, by the way, includes Horizon OS, which is why I started with that name change. And so at this point, they're inventing Horizon Worlds, they're inventing Horizon, they're inventing Horizon OS, and actually they're also inventing the Quest, right? Because they're constantly improving the hardware technology. In the past, I've called this sort of broad spread from top to bottom, all 4 layers of the stack, all 4 layers of the hierarchy, Zuck's nightmare. I've called it that because it's just too much to invent with not enough talent, right? Even if you had all the talent in the world, right? Focusing on a couple layers of the stack is what we've seen basically every other company do in the past. Because guess what? Really talented people worked at Microsoft. Really talented people worked at Google. All of these things were a part of these platform shifts, and they still did not invent more than 2.5 layers of the stack at any given point in time. Zuckerberg, again, is trying to invent all four simultaneously. I think that that is the thing that I beat the drum most heavily about when it came to Quest and the troubles that they've had, that by starting from the very top, they went to the interpersonal computing part before they got to the personal computing part, which is at the bottom. This is probably where it's worth talking about Apple, because we know that their strategy is to build those bottom two layers first. And you guessed it, that's exactly what they did when they released the Apple Vision Pro. So at this base layer, they have the Apple Vision Pro. And on top of that, they built their firmware, which was Vision OS. Great. Now, they have a couple apps on there, but they think that their two bottom layers are compelling enough as a grouping to be able to sell hardware, which is their goal. And ultimately, by creating a really great piece of hardware and really great firmware to run on top of that, opening up the software layer to developers, they believe will naturally kind of happen over time as long as they continue improving the platform. And that means in all ways, technologically, in terms of the relationship with the community, in terms of the growing customer base, all of those things are a piece of that. But they've focused on two really important layers. That's what I want you to take away from this. They focused on two important layers instead of on four. And so in response to this, Zuckerberg made a move. I think knowing that, at the beginning, things tend to be integrated and that, that's actually not a bad thing because he has a running start in the first place. And so what happened is that just like Microsoft and just like Android before him, he said, you know what? This firmware layer is really the important layer for us to control, the same way that Google controls Android. Because if people continue to make apps for this, well, that's great for us because it still supports our platform, gets more devices into more people's hands, and allows us to build the service that we want, Horizon Worlds, in order to connect people in the way that we want and make money in the way that we want, which is, in the case of Facebook, selling ads, right? And so you get people over here like Lenovo or like Asus who are going to make those and drive the price down for these devices and make it more accessible to people. That's the bull case for the Quest, by the way. By making these things cheaper, it makes it easier for people to justify it, but I still think that it's not enough because when we go back, people started buying this not just because they were cheap, but because they were useful. There was something that they wanted to do on it. There's just nothing like that in the VR space yet that compels people enough to buy a cheap device, let alone an expensive device like an Apple Vision Pro. And so it's looking pretty bleak for this platform, sort of like dual at this point. And that's where things get interesting and why I wanted to talk about these two pieces of news. The first part of that news that I talked about, where Meta has separated out what they call their metaverse platform, speaks to the approach that they are taking here. Here's why. The metaverse platform, the Quest, the hardware that is underneath it, is now under a guy who's known for software. The guy running that group is known for software, and they call it the Metaverse platform, which is ultimately a services play. So all of those things underneath it will be subsumed by the goals that are necessary to create the service that they want to create. And that's a good thing, ultimately, right? It gives them focus to some extent, and it makes sense why Zuck would have opened up the Quest platform as such. I think that this is less interesting ultimately because of the other thing that's been going on, which is the last product on here that I have not built yet, but there's a secret third product that I'm going to put on this last layer, which is those Ray-Bans. We'll get to that in a second, and that's the other piece of what's going on in that world. But before we get to that, I want to talk about what Apple is doing because I think it speaks to it on its own and it bridges the gap well. The report about Apple moving to a place where they are no longer pushing on the pro side of things and instead want to go down market towards something that's more accessible and cheaper for the average consumer signals that they see a threat partially by Quest and by what Meta is doing. And number two, that they may think that it's the better strategic direction for the platform because that's the thing that they're doing is ultimately building a great platform that they think that they can win developers the same way they won them for the iPhone with. Right? And so by going down market, it makes it more appealing to a developer because now I have more people who can buy it. It makes it more appealing to more developers who might not be able to afford a $3,500 device, right? It gets the device in more hands, which sets the bar for the level of quality that people think that they deserve out of their computer, which Apple believes is, a competitive advantage that they have over Meta. and I think rightly so. But the important thing is that they have now turned their sights, whereas before they stood on the mountain and were looking above and said, we don't care about that Meta thing. We don't care about what's going on with Quest. Now they are saying, we do. We notice you down there, and we notice that more people are buying those, and we actually see that as partially a threat to our business, because what we care about is developers buying our thing and customers buying our thing. So more people will build more apps for the platform. They care about getting the mind share of developers, especially for building those apps. Okay, bear with me. We're going to round things out here. That finally brings us to the last piece that we left out before. So remember, Reality Labs is divided now into the metaverse, which is this crazy Zuck's nightmare, although it's slightly less so because now it's only 3 rungs, right, instead of 4 side of things. And then we also have these Meta Ray-Bans, which, by the way, have a piece of hardware at the very bottom. It's glasses that are what he calls AR glasses that are just like this, and I would generally agree. So these are the Ray-Bans, Ray-Ban. And on top of that, they have some operating system. That's a piece of firmware. Okay. Good news is that that's it for now for us, right? It's actually a relatively simple stack. And it's really interesting because, first of all, these are vertically integrated, just like Apple does. And from my understanding, they're actually making money selling the hardware, which is quite fascinating, right? More interestingly, though, is that there's a second secret paradigm shift that's going on at the same time. Now, people have said it before, and in fact, I think that Nilay Patel at The Verge has talked about, people have said that AI is a platform shift moment. I want to meditate on that because paradigm shifts are not always platform shifts. It depends on how they play out. In fact, we can see back here throughout history, when it came to this, that was not a paradigm shift. It was just a platform shift because of a branch, right? When it was here to here, it was a paradigm shift, but not a platform shift because people stuck with Microsoft, even though Apple got to that next paradigm shift first. Finally, this from here to here was a paradigm shift because there was a service out there that allowed that shift to happen, and because Apple built a compelling enough product, bottom 2 layers, in order for people to buy it on its own without being a computing platform on its own, if that makes sense. And interestingly, of the 3, it seems like this might be one of the best selling, right? And at least in terms of outrunning expectations. I know that the Quest has sold a lot, but it seems like it has been quite a surprise just how good these Ray-Bans have been selling to Meta. And in my eyes, what I think is going on here, the way I read what is going on with the shift, is that it seems like that is going to become much more of a focus than the Quest is, frankly, at this point in time. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to stop, right? And I know that that's still important to them. They renamed the whole company Meta, right? The metaverse, of course, is going to be something that he pushes for all along the way. But what has happened here is that Meta has created this 2 ways of making their AR, VR devices cheaper. In one case, this middle case, well, they said we're going to commoditize, we're going to increase competition and make devices cheaper by making the hardware cheaper because everyone else is making it. But in this case, they've said we are going to remove a ton of features. There's no displays on it right now. There's not a lot it can do. It can just record video and give you kind of half-baked hallucinating AI answers. But guess what? People really like the product and they're continuing to buy it because it is simple and they see the use case for it off the get-go, which is fascinating. And so by stripping things down, it made it cheaper and it made it more accessible to more people. Apple is kind of realizing the same thing with the Apple Vision Pro. They say, we're going to actually build a second little box down here, which is going to be our Apple Vision Air, right? And we're going to strip some things out of it, like this crazy eyesight potentially, and some of the specs for the internal displays on each eye, and reduce the weight by maybe using a different material and things like that. So they're stripping down, trying to march down market by also doing what Meta was doing, more so in the Ray-Bans than with the Quest, which I think is fascinating personally.
Meta is quietly winning the AI wearable race here because the Ray-Bans are something that Meta has not done in a while, you could argue, maybe ever, but shipped a really good consumer product.
Yeah, you're 100%
It's something
right.
that like normal people like, something that tech people like, because it's got the AI, and yeah, the AI still hallucinates, but it's very fast and it's right like maybe half the time. It's not going to like change the world, but in a couple of years you can see where that's going, and it's like, oh, if I have reliable visual AI in Ray-Bans, I may use my phone less, which is the reason Meta's doing all this, by the way. So this is the path Meta is on. They're going full on glasses and really deprioritizing. They hate when I say this, but it feels like that, the Quest, because the Quest is still really struggling. They have some early product market fit with gaming, but the retention is still not very good, I've heard. And the Quest 3, they got a lot of really good things about the mixed reality, right? But it's just not, I don't know why I want to put it on. Whereas the Ray-Bans, it's like, I get it. I have audio on all the time. I can take calls, I can take photos and videos, and I have AI that is starting to work more and more. And by the way, they look like normal glasses, right? So it's just obvious that this is the direction they should go. They seem to now be realizing that, and they're putting all their chips there and laying off some people as a result. So that was the news out of Meta this week.
A little bit of a long one today, a little bit rambly, but I wanted to approach it because we've talked about this in the past, right? We kind of see where this is going. In general, I think that really the path forward for Meta might be more so in this bucket than in this one. I'm not 100% sure, but like if they have a product that's selling, I mean, I think that that's a great thing to lean into, right? And as for Apple, well, it seems like they are under quite a bit of pressure, both in terms of AI being a paradigm shift and in terms of spatial, or in this case, AR being a platform shift as well. It's just kind of fascinating. I think it's maybe the first time that we've ever seen multiple paradigm shifts and potentially leading into a platform shift that's going on. And it makes it feel like the kind of exciting days of tech to me again. You know, it feels like it's been a little while since we've had that. And so kind of fascinating that both have come along at the same time. And I am very excited to see how things shake out.